why do you think most firms don't include, sourcing professionals or the majority of the firm in IC?
To the extent that they don't, I imagine it is all about efficiency. I mean, much of life is about balance. This is just an example where, in my humble opinion, there's a balance. You may sacrifice some efficiency, but you become more efficient if, as we discussed earlier, you have a BD professional that's out there in the field that really knows what they're talking about. They have come to learn so much about so many industries, so many situations, that they can speak authoritatively about whether something is going to pass muster or not.
All right. Well, welcome back to Deal Sorcery. Today, we're joined by Glenn Oken, co-founder and managing director of Mangrove Equity Partners. Glenn has been in private equity since 1989, before deal sourcing was a function, had a name, before CRMs, before the competitive lower middle market that we have today. And after 35 years and 150 plus transactions across 60 plus industries, he's really helped pioneer a dedicated sourcing model and build a firm that competes on operating capabilities, experience, and culture. This episode isn't just about sourcing tactics. It's about how the role has evolved, how real differentiation is identified and communicated, and how firms can really build durable advantage in a market where nothing is truly proprietary. Glenn, thanks for joining us.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, Glenn, 1989. Maybe we can set the stage here. Like, what was going on in 1989 when you started in private equity?
Yeah, well, it certainly was not much of an industry back then. There were a few very famous practitioners whom we kind of worshipped and celebrated and emulated, but it was very, very different. Kind of fun in that there wasn't as much of a playbook. And so there was some trial and error, and there was some creativity, if you want to use that word, if we can use that word in what we do. But it was great fun. And certainly there's a huge advantage in not having much competition.
Take us through your career arc here, right? For those that don't know the legendary story of, from my perspective, one of the godfathers of deal sourcing. Fill us in on this story in your career arc a bit.
Okay, well, it was probably a very good thing that I did start when I did, because I was probably a little underqualified initially. Did not have sort of the classic investment banking / private equity pedigree, going to an undergraduate business school and then a splashy MBA program, maybe some internships and one of those two initially. So coming out of school at the University of Virginia, where I'd leaned more heavily into sciences and into English with some econ and business, I felt that I had to go to a minor market, candidly. And I got a job in a bank training program in Tampa, which was a great education and lucky to have had that. Then moved over to an investment bank that was a primary dealership. But again, there I wasn't in M&A. I was working in a derivatives group until I discovered private equity and had the dumb luck of having a friend who was an extremely early entrant in private equity up in New York. It was John Kirtley. And Jeff Leck was also there. And the two gents decided that while chemical venture partners who they worked for, and just about anybody that figured out how to do a deal, not too unlike today, went up market, but that happened so precipitously, so quickly, it really left a void in the lower middle market. And I'm talking about a void. There were very few people that would bother. We set out to address that market with Florida Capital Partners. It's very lucky. So I remember distinctly trying to figure out, okay, how do I find these opportunities? I remember subscribing, it might surprise you, to every one of the city business journals for any market that was of any size to get their book of lists, which really at that point was listing accounting firms and law firms, and reaching out to those individuals to ask, who are the intermediaries in your backyard, and getting on an airplane and going to places as small as Jackson, Mississippi to figure it out, right? Because didn't know. There was no coconut telegraph of friends at a conference that you could basically ask, so is this market, rich in targets or not? So it was really, really kind of fun to sort of green grass all of that. The market in the lower middle market was completely dominated by business brokers on the buy side, as opposed to investment bankers. So it was a bit of a safari gathering information about target companies through an extensive Q&A with a business broker or with a company owner, operator, just to come to an understanding So it was less efficient in terms of information, but it was wonderfully less efficient in terms of competition and pricing.
Yeah, sounds like a bit of kind of, bushwhacking, right? Like you just like
Yeah.
to your point, kind of on an
Yeah.
expedition,
Yeah.
again, way kind of pre-internet, way before having, any of these databases, you kind of just I guess had to work your way through the network of who knows who could put you in front of who and who might have, to your point, kind of a book of lists, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And ACG was established well before then. But I think at that point, if it's fair to say, we were all kind of figuring it out. So I'd go to, the ACG conferences all over and then buyouts conferences up in New York.
So Glenn, look, it's 1989, right? Like George H.W. Bush is president, the Berlin Wall's
Right.
coming down, Madonna and Phil Collins are on the radio. I think Seinfeld doesn't even exist yet, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, this is like we're flashing back to some of the origins of private equity where it was really barely an industry, sourcing isn't a function, deals trade at maybe what, 4 to 5 times EBITDA at the time,
Right.
right?
That's the norm.
That was the norm. That's what we're talking about. So when we flash back to 89 and then we kind of look at the past 35 years or so, like walk us through what has really changed in private equity over that time and for the role of business development.
An awful lot. We weren't far out of the era of big perms and leg warmers, right, in 1989. But not personally. That
Yeah.
was quite,
Well,
quite the deal. But an awful lot has changed. As a lower middle market practitioner, the biggest change, of course, is the number of competitors, the nature of competitors. Family offices, for example, weren't very active back then. In the lower middle market, virtually all of our deal flow, almost all of the deals that we closed were coming from business brokers as opposed to investment bankers. And that's very impactful because you had two very different sets of motivation. And maybe oversimplifying it, but broadly, the business brokers, they understood that there could be an investment banker going sell side as opposed to the business broker being paid by the buyers who may want to swoop in and take a deal away and sign it up exclusively on the sell side. Business broker often was able to get the attention of the potential seller by saying, look, you're not going to have to pay my fee. The
Right.
buyer will pay the fee.
Right.
And, I don't necessarily need exclusivity. Just give me a little bit of time and I'm going to bring you a great buyer. And so there, the business broker was very keen to find someone that they could trust, who would actually pay them if successful in closing the deal, who would be respectful and show well and know what they're doing and have certainty of close. I mean, the idea was not necessarily, blast the opportunity out to more than maybe 3 people or maybe just one person. It was rather find the right buyer, high percentage game, and get the deal closed and get paid.
So that was the majority of deal flow back then?
Almost the entirety.
Really? Was just like
Yes.
individual kind of buy side brokers finding deals, bringing them to you?
Yeah, and the buy side brokers could range from just an individual to a small organization that could be pretty well organized, but the motivations were as I described often.
So really the job at the time then was to kind of have your little black book of all the brokers and make sure that you're on their radar and are able to communicate what deals they should bring to you.
We brought a very dedicated, exhaustive, disciplined approach in canvassing those business brokers. But it was a very different world from a competitive standpoint.
Interesting. Yeah, I guess point just being when you say different from a competitive standpoint, what do you mean by that?
In an individual transaction, you might occasionally be the only person talking to that business owner, or you're maybe one of 3. Much easier to compete against 2 competitors than 200 for obvious reasons.
It sounds like that's something that's massively evolved then, right? Like that's
Tremendously. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was like all of the business in 89 versus today, like is buy side a small fraction of it, if any?
It's very important and it's still there, thank goodness. But it is the minority by a meaningful measure.
Yeah, where it's all kind of flipped to like just really the sell side advisors, the investment banks really trying to figure out who's got what deals, map the network, and be in front of those the right people that are representing the right deals, right?
Yes, and there's some owners who just don't want to go through a flogged process. Have potential buyers parading through en masse They don't want their information disseminated to hundreds of people.
How is the tech and the information flow? How has that kind of changed over time?
Well, it's embarrassing to admit, but before we built our first CRM out of ACT, we were logging deal flow manually. So that you could only go up from there.
Does manually logging deals mean like index cards and notebooks, or what does that mean pre-act and pre-software?
How about like a ring binder
A ring
and
binder.
sheets
Okay.
of paper? Yeah.
And so you'd show up to what? Did you show up to investment committee with your ring binder and
No, that was just basically logging
yeah.
an opportunity. And then when information came in very, very early on, we would, run over to look at the paper copy of a sim and pour over it together. It's great.
Florida Capital Partners, renowned firm. People have, many people might know, especially if you're a kind of private equity historian, right? What led from going from Florida Capital Partners, the experience you had there, to kind of co-founding Mangrove?
From FCP, where we had, 6 funds, over to forming Mangrove. My original partners had retired by then. They've since come out of retirement, but it was really important to me and to some of the folks at FCP to try to create a new firm, Mangrove, which would really lean into the internal operating capabilities and model and reward the internal operating partners with meaningful carry. At one point, Mangrove had 50% of our carry invested in these individuals because it was worth it, both playing defense and offense. We also had a real desire to optimize things from a cultural standpoint, to build a team to our own blueprint in terms of the individuals, what they were about, not just their capabilities, but their team orientation, their predisposition, their willingness to really live consistently by our core values, which we didn't have initially. We discovered them as we went along, but we kind of knew what we were looking for. People that would unfailingly do the right thing, who are extremely team-oriented, which in private equity, the stakes are high. That can be easier said than done, but life to us is not a zero-sum game. And we extend that mindset beyond our 4 walls to obviously the owners and operators that we work with. Work-life integration was really important. Hiring people with intellectual curiosity, that's essential, right? And that's the fun opportunity in what we do. We're privileged because you can learn so much about so many different things. Humility was a key thing that we were looking for in the team. People that would move the needle. You're going to spend time doing something. We wanted them to really be impactful and be a good partner, which just means being collaborative. And we were very fortunate. We have a group of 14 folks that really live by that and work for each other.
To make sure I kind of heard you here, right? Is like early days, you guys even gave substantial carry to operating partners, right? And to individuals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That was foundational. Yeah, that was essential to us. And it's proven to be the wise choice.
So, Glenn, a lot of experience. I think, what is it, 6 funds at FCP and 3 or 4 at Mangrove now. I think
And a 4th.
Mm-hmm. 4th fund now. So 10 funds, over 150 deals. There's a ton that we're going to get into today that I think will be really interesting for the audience. But maybe just to provide some context so folks know a bit about Mangrove, can you tell us what the pitch is for Mangrove, how you guys engage with businesses, and then what are those businesses that you're after? What does a Mangrove business look like?
In terms of what we're looking for, it's lower middle market, majority or entirety acquisitions in the US and Canada. We're defining lower middle market by companies making between 3 million and 10 million of EBITDA for platforms. And then, of course, add-ons can be much smaller. From an industry standpoint, we've been in, over 60 industries, but they tend to fit into certain buckets. We are repeat offenders to include non-commoditized manufacturing businesses that tend not to be hyper cyclical, so that the ticket item is appropriately sized to satisfy that. I've done an awful lot in mission critical industrial service sectors, often preserving and maintaining people's valuable industrial assets where the cost of downtime is quite high. We've done an awful lot with very niche, enthusiast-driven branded consumer companies, to include 7 platforms in the enthusiast-driven auto aftermarket, which is great fun. It's fun stuff. We've done a fair amount of just very opportunistic work with white-collar service sectors, which don't enjoy quite the same barriers to entry, arguably, but they often can be scaled much more quickly and to a greater degree than some of our manufacturing. The manufacturing business is sort of our origin, if you will, partly born out of the fact that our internal operating partners, the original internal operating partners who are still here, they are manufacturing, wonderkind. One guy is a second generation Deming disciple and has extraordinary talents in sort of core industrial engineering on top of other functional areas of business. Our latest addition to our internal operating team does include somebody who has more experience in sort of the white collar world.
You've mentioned a number of times the kind of Deming disciple. To
Yeah.
me, like, I just think of that as somebody who's like just deeply into continuous improvement, right? What does that mean to you when you're telling like folks that we've got kind of the Deming disciples in house?
If you go way back to Dr. Deming, who tried to convince the U.S. auto industry in the 70s, when the U.S. auto industry was not exactly knocking out of the park from a reliability and quality standpoint. He was turned away by the U.S. auto industry, and my understanding is that when he went to Japan, they espoused it, hence the Toyota method. So an awful lot of the methodologies for quality manufacturing can be sort of derived from Deming's work and people that adopted some of those disciplines. So TQM, 5S, Toyota method, a lot of those buzzwords, which we tend not to use, just sort of go back to that kind of disciplines. And Roger Bates, one of our internal operating partners, who is the head of manufacturing for the world's largest manufacturer of auto OEM airbags, there's Breed Technologies, not Takata, where quality criticality is obvious, right? You're saving people's lives, you're manufacturing with explosives, you have very concentrated, very challenging customers. So you really had to have game in order to do those things right. So that's why I refer to a Deming disciple. He worked under someone who was a direct disciple of Deming, apparently.
So functionally, that means like a big part of what you guys do is really bring excellence and best practices of manufacturing to the companies that you work with, specifically that are industrials and manufacturers. Is that a fair way to kind of characterize?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And those are the first types of industries where they wielded their considerable tool set, right? But as the years went on, we've obviously partnered with and have lots of reps, lots of experience. They have an awful lot of, they have an excellent track record of improving companies that are industrial service businesses or white collar services as well. Going back to sort of description of our box, if you will, of the kinds of things that we most like to do, where we have the most experience, the vast majority of our deals are majority recaps, where on average, I think the owner operators are keeping about 30%, but we're very flexible in that regard. And I lift that up only because it's impactful. Because if an owner operator is keeping a meaningful piece of the company, they obviously care a whole lot more about who they're partnering with. And that's our stock and trade. That's where we can win. We obviously understand we have to be competitive from a pricing standpoint. Sometimes in this environment, that's impossible. It's not going to happen. But the beauty is that when we're close, we do tend to win by virtue of the fact that they care very much about reducing risk and optimizing their value of their retained ownership. They often care very much about their people. And all those things are attributes that I think help us a lot.
If I dropped into Mangrove for 30 days and watched how deals actually get created, can you give us a laydown of the system? Like, what are the inputs, the weekly cadence, and like how does sourcing connect to everything else that you're doing as investors and operators?
I think if I broke it down, you would obviously see an awful lot of outreach, the casting of the net. And that is done with the aid of systems and data. It's done with discipline. It's done in a logical way, trying to reach out to the people with whom we're most likely to find success, to find deals that we will find attractive and where we can possibly win from a value standpoint. So that is a constant battle, right? To reach the right people and to reach them with the right cadence, the right rhythms, and communicating the right message. I mean, that's the job. One, to have a message, a differentiated message, a strategy that is intelligible, and then help those intermediaries connect the dots, make the synaptic connection where they think of you, right, for the right thing. In the investment banking world, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more of a game with investment bankers of understanding what they are focusing on from an industry standpoint, and making sure we educate them as much as possible about our experiences and successes in relevant industries. and make sure we reach out to them, frequently enough and remind them of our existence. With business brokers, it can be a bit different. Some are industry specialized, but there you're particularly leaning into certainty of close, your trustworthiness in terms of paying them on the buy side, being respectful to the owners and the operators that we hope to visit and hope to partner with. And if we have to say no, in both cases, you say no quickly and you say no with a lot of detail so that they can sort of dial in to what will be a perfect match. So casting the net, right? And that's achieved through phone calls, obviously through emails, through city visits, through conference attendance, and sending the right message and the right story about differentiators. In our case, it's value add, typically from an operating partner standpoint and the cultural aspect of really treating all people that we partner with and deal with generously and well. So then there is the sausage making. How do we interact with the rest of the team? Well, one thing that I'd throw out there is that the outreach that I just mentioned, it is done by people that have an awful lot of experience. They've got EQ and they've got IQ, present company excluded, and they have authority, right? They have gravitas and authority, because I've often heard the lamentations from intermediaries that they'll end up speaking with somebody in BD and private equity that doesn't necessarily even know whether it's going to be a fit or not, and they don't have the authority to make that call on the fly, real time, to save an awful lot of time for everybody. So I'm proud to mention that Kristen Bistany and Katie Welch and our team are the points of the spear these days out in the field. They have the experience, the knowledge, the sophistication, and the authority to make those calls. So then interacting with a team, once something passes an initial screen, and that initial screen is taking right now about 3,000 deals per annum, and winnowing that down to the opportunities that we then want to engage the rest of the team with. And that is quite a big filter. That's a big screen. We then will find another set of eyes and ears, a champion, if you will. That could be on the execution side of the team. It could be on the operation side of the team. And that opportunity is presented to the entire team. And I think that's important, because I think it's key to understand that the entire team is hearing about, learning about, participating in the Q&A, and providing an opinion about every single deal that makes it to that Monday morning meeting. We expect people to be engaged. We expect people to have an opinion. We expect them to share that opinion. That does an awful lot to advance people in them taking responsibility and advancing their thinking process. They become more valuable to the team much more quickly that way.
How big is the Mangrove team today?
14 people.
It sounds like the majority of all those 14 folks are in investment committee every week.
Every single one of them.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, that's not common across private equity.
Yeah, we do things a little bit differently, arguably. But you think about it. Instead of, while we are siloed along functional lines, and I've always thought that was very important, to make sure that the right people are doing the right jobs, and to make sure that everyone is focused and has time to do a job with excellence, and that they also have accountability for that silo, if you will. I've always felt that was very important. But in terms of people's education, people's advancement, and the advantages of getting multiple opinions and observations and questions from a group of 14, pretty sharp people, it's valuable. And think about it. If you were just in the silo, they'd get pretty boring. You wouldn't see the big picture, and you wouldn't learn as much. It wouldn't be nearly as rewarding a career.
Why do you think most firms don't include, sourcing professionals or the majority of the firm in IC?
To the extent that they don't, I imagine it is all about efficiency. I mean, much of life is about balance. This is just an example where, in my humble opinion, there's a balance. You may sacrifice some efficiency, but you become more efficient if, as we discussed earlier, you have a BD professional that's out there in the field that really knows what they're talking about. They have come to learn so much about so many industries, so many situations, that they can speak authoritatively about whether something is, going to pass muster or not.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I was really fortunate at Sarent to be part of every investment committee discussion. And to your point, it meant that I actually knew what was going on, right? And I actually
Yeah.
knew what deals we were looking at, like how we evaluated those deals, why we turned things down, what we were going to sell, and why we were going to sell it, all that sort of stuff. And I feel like,
Yeah.
to me, it feels so short-sighted. To your point, like maybe the benefit is efficiency, but it feels really short-sighted to not include BD and sourcing professionals in IC. I don't know, Matt, do you have a sense for, like, I don't know if you asked this when you talk to folks, like what percentage of BD and sourcing folks are actually part of IC on a regular basis?
Yeah, it's like an interesting point here where it sounds so obvious in how it equips the people who are representing your firm out in the market with the information that they need, but is not that common. There are a lot of folks out there that don't have the information that they need to do the job well. It is not common. It's definitely tied to seniority. The more senior you are, the more likely you're involved in those conversations. But I think it's definitely outside of the norm to have it structured this way.
But I think to Glenn's point, like having, Kristen and Katie and every member of the sourcing team, regardless of seniority, like involved in those discussions, like those are actually the people that are going to benefit most, learn most, come up the curve the most versus anybody else, right? Like you need them to kind of have that information. So to your point, Glenn, they can have the authority, the gravitas, like they actually can speak for the firm, which is the whole point, right? Is for sourcing and BD to kind of be the tip of the spear.
Yeah. And as you lifted up just young people in general, it's tremendously helpful to young people because there's so many esoteric things that come up, and it's just one more arrow in the quiver of things that they come to understand, things to watch out for, things to take into consideration in execution, for example. We're talking about balance a little bit, and it makes me think about the importance of, in BD, balancing process and systems for efficiency again, right? And for accuracy, for getting a good laser beam on the right people to communicate your message to. But I think there's a balance with the relationship building, right? If you become too obsessed with efficiency, then it's possible that someone could, underemphasize relationship building, some of which may not be very efficient. I guarantee you, if I am on a call with someone, especially an owner operator, but in a deal source as well, it's not efficient for me to spend the time to really get to know that person, to find commonality, to have some fun with them, to listen to them in a way where eventually subsequent calls or visits or experiences, you might actually be helpful to that person. And it may be on a very personal level in terms of things that are going on with their kids, or things that are going on in their personal life, or even a healthcare issue. I actually had an experience with one of your former colleagues, Dan, regarding an introduction to a really good healthcare provider. Anything that you can do, you do it not in a Machiavellian way or motivation. You do it because you genuinely care. And, when we're hiring for any function, but especially BD, we're really looking for athletes, figuratively speaking, who are going to be good at both. They're going to be good at thinking analytically, at process and at systems, but they're also just sort of preternaturally human. They're going to be people that are going to want connection. They're going to want relationship. And if you do both of those things, I think it's very powerful.
So it seems like we're now touching on a really interesting subject, right? Which is where to spend time. Prioritization of focus, to me, has always been kind of the number one job in deal sourcing and business development, right? How do you think about where an individual, the firm as a whole, should spend time, like with whom, and and kind of how they should allocate? Like how do you make those decisions?
Well, from a BD standpoint, the biggest time sink obviously is with intermediaries and in garnering deal flow and then processing deal flow. With other members of the firm focused on other functions, their time management is something very different. But it all boils down to the same thing. Let's spend our time on what's going to have the greatest impact, and let's be mindful and disciplined about what deals we can win, what deals we should win, and what's going to serve that end. From a BD standpoint, data is extraordinarily helpful. It's king when it comes to knowing where to spend your time. So it's not just a dart in the dark. You're really gathering every bit of information about every deal that is submitted. And of course, tenant with that is who shared that with you. And you know in what industries they've shown you deals. You know the size of those deals. You hopefully will eventually know the end result. Did we lose? Did we lose because of pricing, which is typically why we lose, and by how much? It starts to build a map. And if you're using your CRM correctly, if it's set up to codify all of these details, then you start to develop a very good map. You have to, use that in a sort of it's a crass term maybe, but a ranking function where you are saying, okay, who are the people that I'm going to see, quality deal flow from, relevant deal flow from, that we can win.
Is that all just based on historical context, the quality and volume of what you see? I mean, or are you ingesting like external or other data to figure out like who else maybe we're not in front of that we need to be?
You're getting a sense in a first conversation before you have a history, right? In a first conversation, even you're asking the right questions, so you're going to know in what industries does someone traffic, in what sizes, and you're going to capture that, and that's going to help you. It's going to give you a sense, but the history over time is going to confirm your suspicion, or you're going to change your assessment there.
It sounds like you build this map because you're operating in sort of chaotic world that is not defined necessarily. There are many, many contacts. Those contacts go to different institutions, and you have to kind of control the chaos in a bit. But if I asked you to maybe hone in on, I don't know, a few different strategies or tactics as we talk about like prioritizing your time, what do you think are the ones that drive the most outcomes?
You're making me think of the power of communicating an exit, because you're telling a story. You may choose to send that email to different audiences, maybe in slightly different ways, depending on who they are. But I've always felt that there's extreme power in an email that describes what you did, especially what you did that others won't do or can't do. Won't do speaks to flexibility typically, and can't do usually has to do with real operational value add. What functional areas were suboptimized, and how did you optimize them? What were the results of this? What did that do to your lead times? What did it do to your output? What did it do to sales and EBITDA? What did it do for the people involved? Did your owner operator that retained 30% of the company double or triple the value of what they rolled over? All of these things are about as powerful as anything that I can think of as we sort of interact with deal sources. Since people themselves are trying to be efficient, they're thinking of what industries they are involved in if they're focused. And if we are someone that has had a great success in a relevant industry to their world, that's productive as well. There is no doubt in my mind that just activity begets activity.
And what does that mean to you? That means just like enough internal activity begets enough external activity coming back?
When people see that you've been active and successful, they think of you, and hopefully they'll connect dots on something that they're working on.
That's why Dan and I post so much on LinkedIn.
Make everybody think that we're successful, that we got stuff going on. Yeah.
So we've talked about how part of BD's effectiveness in the context of a private equity firm can actually be saving time for the deal team by disqualifying, right? Can you say more about that? And what is a business development professional's role in making that call?
Fortunately, we're solving for stability of cash flows and a cogent value creation thesis. And the vast majority of industries don't lend themselves to stability of cash flow. So it is not that difficult for a great many of the opportunities to just see that it just really isn't going to be a fit, even if you are flexible. And as a sidebar, one of our forms of flexibility that is different from an awful lot of people is not being overly dogmatic about certain things. By that, I mean, sometimes you'll see an opportunity and there'll be headline risk. But if you have enough experience and sort of little pattern recognition, or if you roll up the sleeves and you dig in, you might find that complexity is low-lying fruit. as opposed to something prohibitive that truly jeopardizes stability. So flexibility, I think, in that screening process needs to be laid over the desire for, quick response and detailed response and efficiency of really only spending any time on things that you think have a good chance of being attractive.
We've started talking a bit here about intermediaries, brokers, bankers, people that you kind of work with, and obviously, I think a big part of your guys' deal flow, especially for platform transactions. I've also heard you talk a lot about how intermediaries are kind of the lifeblood, and you treat them like your customers.
Yeah.
I'm fairly confident you maybe even have some key insights about like how to strategically build relationships with folks, maybe even like how big SaaS companies might handle. But like, what does it mean to treat intermediaries as your customers, and how do you manage those relationships?
A lot of it has to do with just putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, which is, I guess, the cornerstone of relationships, full stop. And for an intermediary, they're looking for responsiveness. I can't believe that, and we hear it all the time. Thank you for responding, or thank you for responding so quickly, or thank you for your detailed response. It's pretty amazing that folks might not realize that that is absolutely essential. That's what an intermediary wants, and it's what they need, and it's what they deserve. Yeah, we absolutely culturally want to respect and show gratitude to our lifeblood, as you said. It's the intermediaries. It is interesting, going back to sort of our old school versus current days discussion. Over the decades, it's been fascinating to see kind of how at certain periods, especially early on, intermediaries weren't necessarily treated with the respect which just made common sense and which is the right thing. And even with limited partners, I've seen a bit of a roller coaster in terms of who seemed to think they were in the catbird seat. Bottom line is, I'll go back to one of our core values, and that was, humility. If you don't have the appropriate level of appreciation and humility, I think people can get in trouble with these things.
It's interesting, right? Like we're continually, I'm just kind of seeing and hearing this pattern for us in this conversation of a conflict between, I think, what most people think of as efficiency on one side, and I guess quality or detail or
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
on the other. I don't know. It's interesting, right? I feel like we all get so addicted to the idea of volume, right? I think everybody has in their head that like, well, this is a numbers game, and like, I've got 800 NDAs I have to get through this year, and I'm going to look at, 3,000 transactions in a year, and and so it's just like, I've got to get through that volume. I got to get through that volume, right? But it's like the way that you, to your point, build the relationships that compound over time and ensure that you actually see the high quality deal flow is by putting in the extra work and
Hmm.
having that detailed and thoughtful response and being responsive. But you can't be everything to everybody, right? So I don't know, is it just about saying, okay, here's the folks that I'm going to be the most responsive with and provide the detailed responses to, and prioritizing those? Or do you try to just be responsive and have detailed responses to everybody? I don't know. Like, how
Right.
do you think about managing that conflict?
You can, I think, bring efficiencies to processes. We do it with our responses. Doesn't mean the response can't be a few extra words to explain the why it's not a good fit. Or if in the extreme, it's not for me, but my friend over here who has a fund, they've been active in that industry. It doesn't take any time. So we can use systems, we can use language that we're so used to using that it doesn't take a moment's thought to offer that courtesy. We increase efficiency in this process by using an addendum, for example, to NDAs, so that no matter what the language is, that next NDA, because there's so many that you sign, the addendum covers the important things to us. It lends efficiency. So where you can bring efficiencies through innovations or processes and systems, you do it. And you're right, you don't spend an inordinate amount of time on a rejection of a deal that was so far off the mark that, and maybe from experience with that individual, you happen to know they're not really paying much attention at all to what we do and what we're communicating. The likelihood of success together is not great, and you might not spend as much time there.
Let's keep going on that thread. This idea of banker reciprocity has come up a number of times, and I'm curious your kind of outlook on it, because there are only so many portfolio companies, right, that you sell or that come to market, and there's only one banker that will do that. So I'm curious if you have a view on whether you try to spread the wealth, or do you always go with the bank that's right for the company, or any sort of thoughts on that?
I know that a former colleague, Jay Jester, has been very thoughtful and done a great job of figuring that out over the years. Our approach is that we have a responsibility to our limited partners and to the shareholders of a portfolio company. And we do want to hire the right investment banker for an exit. And that is often driven by industry, right? And the relationships that the banker has in that industry. Also baked into our decision-making is the size of that institution. And will our little project be orphaned? We're lower middle market guys. And so maybe we grew that company to 10, 15, million of EBITDA, but it's not a big deal for most of these investment banks. So we have to take into consideration what kind of staffing attention we would get. Only when those things, I think, have been figured out do we then look at the overall relationship. It is important, but it's not primary in our efforts. We're pretty simple. We pretty much work by fundamentals and what makes logical sense to us. While that relationship is important, it doesn't wag the dog.
So Glenn, you've talked a little bit about in the past with us about this idea of like canvassing, like once you figure out who you're going to engage, basically canvassing that market with or those people with precision and discipline. I guess the biggest questions I have is like, what does that mean? And then two, how do you effectuate that? Like, what are the systems and processes you need to have in place? Do you tag those folks? Do you have SLAs or expectations of how you engage them? So maybe just like, what does it mean to have the precision and discipline to now canvas and engage the people that you've prioritized?
The precision part is being accurate in understanding, where to spend the treasure of your time. And then the discipline part is making sure that if you set out to stay in touch with that particular individual on a particular rhythm, it might be quarterly, it might be twice a year, it might be annually, that you're using your systems to maintain that discipline in doing so.
Does that just mean tracking outreach and engagement, like number of engagements, last time that they were engaged, last time you had a conversation with them, and just kind of flagging if they fall within the parameters of what you'd expect?
Sure, but you're also hopefully memorializing the dialogue. Leaving a voicemail doesn't cut it. And so if you've left a voicemail, then your goal is to try to have a Zoom call and schedule one and have it be more impactful. But whatever you learn in that conversation, whether it is deal related or relationship related, personal, you want to codify it.
Got it. So you think about that discipline as both ensuring that the appropriate actions were taken in order to, procure the engagement, but then the second piece being you have the discipline to collect, gather, to your point, codify the takeaways and action items as a result of that conversation.
Yes.
And in order to accomplish that, and you and I have talked about this a bit, right? You kind of have to not only build the right processes and systems, but a lot of times kind of comes down to setting the right tone and the right culture. You're one of the most genuine and most unflappable guys I've kind of ever known in private equity. And I know you've emphasized perseverance as one of the traits of the best businesses and business builders that you guys have worked with. How do you build that right amount of perseverance into your culture?
I think that it's a combination of, yes, the scars that when you have in your career seen unexpected disappointment, a deal goes pretty far down the road and somebody behaves aberrantly, or, the numbers completely tank, or just some unforeseen eventuality takes place. The axiom, nothing is done till it's done, surely applies to the deal world. So if you've worked so hard, to cast that net, to get deals in, to process deals, you find something that the entire team likes, and off you go, and people work extraordinarily hard to get things close to a finish line, and then there's disappointment. Is that discouraging? It certainly, would be and could be for most people. But when you've seen that happen and you understand that, you pick a cliche, don't count your chickens until they hatch, nothing is done till it's done. It's still a disappointing surprise, but it just doesn't send you into apoplexy. You just don't lose it over it because it happens. So that's the scar tissue part of it, right? And when a younger person goes through that and they see, you modeling, I think, the right response or an attitude, to some extent, this is a numbers game and nothing's done till it's done. And celebrate the good parts of the effort. That was a good at bat, right? You'll hear that in our shop, fairly often. Here's what was really good about that. And you learn from it, or you just accept it and move on. It comes with the territory. I think another big part of it, guys, is hiring the right people in the first place. Because in order to be good at this job, I think you do have to be somewhat of an optimist, right? I think you do have to be inherently resilient. I think you have to be patient because you deal with all kinds of people, and some people may not be your cup of tea, and vice versa, I'm sure. But you have to be patient and respectful and persevere.
I think in our job, in our role, like you have to be, I guess, constantly, like, I don't know if you want to call it toes to the nose or like, aggressively forward leaning, right? Like you can't be sitting on your hands, right? Like you have to be out there grinding away every day, but you have to also balance that with, to your point, the patience and almost the Zen mindset of, it'll be what it'll be. And I tend to say, like, it's all kind of nothing until it's something,
Yeah, right.
But it's such a funny balance to strike, right? Between saying, like, I'm going to be aggressive and out there and pushing all the time, but like, I know that everything is nothing until it's something.
Yeah, there's so much work that doesn't bear fruit. That's part of it.
Right.
But along the way, you are going to have so many amazing relationships, right? You're going to have fun, hopefully. I mean, that should be an objective. It helps you do a good job. It helps people respond to you well. You're going to learn an awful lot. And when you do get the right things done, and then you do the right things with those opportunities to optimize the value, it's worth it. And there's also the thrill of the hunt, right? That's kind of an interesting mindset.
It is.
I think the right people in the function, they really enjoy that moment when that relationship panned out and that right opportunity comes across.
I don't know. There's still nothing like that high of, a new actionable opportunity that you brought in the door, right?
Except an exit when you're
an exit. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. Speaking about how we do sourcing and particularly how you guys have approached it, obviously, I know you built a very operator-centric model, right? Obviously demonstrated by kind of giving carry to early operators. And, I've just seen and experienced that myself and working with you over the years. But you mentioned in a podcast a few years ago how you kind of underestimated the power of operators in sourcing. What do you view as the power of operators in sourcing? And then I guess the second part of this is we've just been talking about this concept of kind of ops theater and how so many folks today are overhyping, operational support, or, I think you said the other day, kind of waving the hanky at it. How do you prove that operational credibility in a noisy market?
Regarding an ops theater, that's real. We were extraordinarily early. By 1990, we were moving towards an internal operating role, and it's just proven itself to be invaluable. Eventually, limited partners began to ask for that. They were screening for people that had internal operating capabilities because it reduces risk significantly, especially in the lower middle market. Companies hit speed bumps. And with internal operating partners, the right ones, the ones that truly have operating backgrounds, truly have operating talent, I think the likelihood of surviving through a speed bump and then thriving thereafter and then playing offense and optimizing value, having survived, is far greater. And there is something referred to ops theater where people really don't have it. And it's as simple as looking at the people. Are they truly available? Are they in-house? Or are they retired folks that they hope to grab off of the golf course that were leaders in a Fortune 500 company that has nothing to do with, a family-owned business? Or are they people that have the backgrounds that are available? They've got the capabilities, they've got the capacity, and they're going to roll up their sleeves while having a real human touch and working collaboratively with the incumbent people in coaching and lifting them up, in strategic planning in a way that includes the team at the company, the incumbent people, and mutually arriving at the vital few things that will really move the needle, and then providing the tools, including coaching or recruiting or capital, to execute on those initiatives. You can't fake that. One of the funnest things to me is going on a target company visit with one of our, really good internal operating partners and quickly becoming wallpaper. Because watching a dialogue, when it's operator to operator, sometimes engineer to engineer, and they don't go in acting like they know everything. They're there to learn, to listen, with a lot of respect for the entrepreneur that took huge risks, who figured stuff out, and who built a great company, and who has employed a lot of people and helped a lot of people. And then to geek out regarding the innards of that company, about the industrial engineering, about the workflows, about the machinery, about the processes, about every functional aspect of that business, new product development, pricing strategies, go-to-market strategy, and have a dialogue where the nature of your questions, one, will excite the owner because this is his or her baby, right? They love this stuff. This is what they want to talk about, not finance, right? And the questions aren't just checking boxes. They're on the fly, and they evidence an awful lot of experience with manufacturing or with business processes, with people, with all the functional areas of the business. So you can distinguish yourself from people who are waving a hanky, I think, pretty readily. References certainly do that. So we certainly encourage company owners and expect them to speak with a number of our, current or former portfolio partners. And those dialogues tend to go towards, so what did these guys do for you? Happily, I think the answers are typically quite positive and enthusiastic.
That all makes sense, especially once you get to the point where you're having a management meeting, right? And you're doing a plant tour. The big question is like in advance of that, right? Because I think one of the comments was about underestimating the power of operators in sourcing. Like before you're able to kind of have that in-person time and convey that, like how do you prove that operational credibility for the earlier stages of sourcing?
Well, remember that when we talked about the importance of having the right strategy and having the right message as the starting point to me of a good BD effort, right? What are you going to communicate? Well, we're communicating that value add, that risk reduction, and that value optimization with the intermediaries. And so the intermediary, if they care to, they'll be passing that on to a client who cares about these things. If the owner operator isn't keeping a piece, they may not care as much. If the company is squeaky clean perfection and there's no room for improvement, they may not care about this stuff. But if the intermediary chooses to describe us, one of the things they will probably describe is this capability.
And I think one of the other things that you'd shared, which to me is maybe even the most powerful piece of this, is really about the storytelling element, right? Of, I don't know, do you want to click into that? Like you're talking about like what happens around an exit and kind of what you message?
This is the beauty of having been around for a while, as a firm or as a team or as an individual, is you can match the hatch. You see a particular industry or a particular situation, and you have a relevant, true story to lift up to evidence the value add. So one old example that a few people have heard was really a very gratifying one coming out of disaster long ago, back in the FCP days. We had a partnership with an environmental service company domiciled in New Orleans, and they were wiped out in Hurricane Katrina. They were right downtown. And we had 50 homeless families. There was one member of the leadership team who could not find his wife. Happily did eventually. We honestly were thinking, well, we don't have a company anymore. This is a write-off. But remember our first core value of do the right thing. Why would you, if you're only interested in efficiency, why would you invest time and why would you invest money in helping, but we did the right thing. And our internal operating team was the perfect group to sort of scramble the jets, figuratively speaking. They rented residential trailers, stocked them with everything from diapers to beer, and created a bit of a company camp. And those amazingly resilient people, to our shock, started to get back to work. They ran around and they found fuel supply at the docks, not at a retail level, not at a wholesale level. They went to the docks and secured fuel. They ran around and found rolling stock and boats and repowered those assets to get back to work. And as you might suspect, there was an awful lot of work to do in the environmental service area after Katrina. They grew tenfold. And then the BP oil spill hit and they grew again significantly, about 5x from that point, settling down eventually to that middle point, which was still representing huge growth. So when we do, to answer your question, send that email about an exit, as we're about to do after a very fun exit with a wonderful company, with a great team that was the country's dominant manufacturer of an enthusiast branded consumer product. After 40 years of doing so well in an area, it's kind of natural, it's human nature, not to push to figure out what you don't know or what you're not doing. You're being very successful. And so we partnered with this company, and Roger Bates, one of our internal operating partners, did his thing. There was the strategic planning, there was the assessment of what the needs were in order to break through an inflection point and grow as much as we could and take everybody along, in that growth. But the functional areas were completely re-engineering the plant, changing workflows to be much more efficient and less wasteful, figuring out the best supply arrangements such that we ceased buying as much from China and inputs, minimized that, got more vertical in what we're manufacturing in terms of components, created a direct-to-consumer function that became a very large part of the business that increases margins significantly. We worked pricing umbrella, recruited the right people to fill gaps in the team, especially as you grow. New product development, really goosed that up quite a bit, and made one small add-on acquisition. So you're pulling on all levers. And I think that is great fun. And I think it's done better with people that have done an awful lot of it rather than financial engineers.
So Glenn, obviously something else that's changed over the course of sourcing is, the people that are doing it, right? And I think you're one of the best to ever do it. You're probably, one of the gen ones of deal sourcing. Like, who else do you view as kind of the best of the Gen 1 deal sourcers?
Well, I think that they're the best of the best for a couple of reasons. One is they're consummate professionals and they're great at the job, but they're also the best of the best because they were just professional human beings. I mean, tends to be a pretty tight, close-knit group of friends because they were just terrific people. They are terrific people. And I'm sure many of them have been or will be, lucky enough to participate in your podcast. But Jay Jester, I'm a little bit biased having worked with Jay, but Jay is an extraordinary BD professional, private equity partner and person and friend. Gretchen Perkins, of course,
yep.
Right? And Gretchen has done so much with ACG. I believe Gretchen was one of the really important folks in trying to improve private equity's reputation in Washington and in general in media, which is appropriate. I mean, yes, there are bad actors, but there's an awful lot of good that is done. And she's been integral to that effort. John Camp, of course.
Yep.
He's an OG extraordinaire and a great friend. Charlie Gifford.
Yep.
Another great example of like Jay, somebody who's been a co-founder and a leader as a partner, proving that BD is vital. Mark Jones, you have to include Jonesy in that, and a great guy and a great professional. And Bob Landis would be on that list as well. I'm sure there are many others. These are some of the OGs that I know, but guys like Larry Simon, some of the younger folks are extraordinary too.
Did you guys interact back in the day? Like, we think back to, 90s. I don't know. Were you guys getting together, having, trading deals, having party? I don't know, going on the ski slopes. I don't know. Did you guys interact at all?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was very pleasantly surprised that there didn't seem to be any competitive pressures at all to get in the way. In part, it's because different folks were chasing different things, but there's an awful lot of overlap too. And everybody to a person in that list was just generous and fun. And yeah, we would definitely have good time in addition to the work time if we would get together at a conference or otherwise.
I love that.
Glenn, if you were launching a firm today and a sourcing function, at a PE firm today, I'm curious how you'd go about it. And I ask that within the context of a lot of what you've shared today is the importance of articulating your differentiators to the market. But if I, kind of hamstring you a little bit and you don't have the prior experience, the deals done and exited to refer to, I'm curious your take, new firm entering the market 2026. How would you go about it?
I think that you're going to hamstring me, or you're going to try to, but I do believe that a foundational thing is figuring out if it can't be who you have been, then who do you want to be? What do you want to do? And what do you want to do differently? You can set strategy, through the windscreen as opposed to the rearview mirror. So even without an awful lot of historical data, I think you can still try to determine what you can do better or differently and communicate that. The next obvious step is hiring the right people. I think if I was starting a new operation, I think that I would still want to try to attract a BD leader who does have an awful lot of experience and a rich set of relationships just to start. So you're not starting cold. That person, and then I think a few people that you'd want to hire around that individual, you would want them to be the right people. We've talked a good bit about what they need to have intellectually, what they need to have emotionally, what kind of relationship building skills they have, what kind of resilience they have. So the people, obviously, that you'd hire would be key. You'd have to arm those people with the right tech stack, the right CRM, the customized, database, and you'd have to institute the right disciplines with respect to, accuracy, precision, right, and then maintain the disciplines to do the job. And if the group is new, they're going to have to hit the road, because your initial interactions with people, I think, my humble opinion, I think they have to be in person. And once you've established those relationships, once you've built some commonality and some trust, then I think you can do more remotely.
Let's talk more about people for BD specifically. Given your experience hiring and interacting with folks, do you have thoughts on the right profile, background, characteristics of people for this role?
If I had to boil it down, I think there'd be a couple things. I don't think there is a totally specific requirement with respect to background, but I think there are some aspects to their background and to the people that would be key. One is they'd have to be, technically competent. They'd have to have had a background which would make them, facile with financials. So, and just in business in general, you want them to know their way around business and certainly around finance and accounting to some extent, right? And those things can be taught, but I think you want a foundation there. So, for example, one of our BD partners here, Katie Welch, she came out of EY. She was an audit, manager. She certainly has the technical capabilities, but she has all the other skills that we talked about in terms of relationship building, and just a very bright woman. Kristen Bistany, another one of our BD partners, she did not have the background that you would expect, but she's extraordinarily bright. She learned really here and was with us from the very beginning. I put Kristen up, who really is leading the charge of our BD effort, up with anybody in terms of her knowledge and her capabilities and her effort.
What about just the right structure of a BD team within a PE firm? Like if we take a couple of things for granted or assumptions here, like if we're talking a middle market, lower middle market buyout firm, $500 million fund, you've seen a lot of different approaches to hiring into sourcing within those types of firms. What's your view? Like how many people is too many? Is one enough?
We have 3 people that are toting water from a BD standpoint, and then a very valuable admin plus resource who's actually screening lists of deals. So there's some real responsibility there and capability there. But so that is 4 people. And I think that is a fulsome team. I certainly don't think one is adequate. I think more than four is superfluous, probably. How you have that team work together and compensated, I think, is extremely important. First off, I think it's such a valuable function that people should be well compensated. And our approach to it is through equity. So both Kristen and Katie are partners, and they have equity. And before that, they had phantom equity. Before that, they had, and they still, obviously salary and bonus. So I think adequate compensation is really important, but there's different ways you can skin that cat, and they will have impact on esprit de corps, on culture and behaviors. You could have a complete eat what you kill model, right? Just like private equity, we talked about what did private equity look like back in the day. You didn't have dedicated BD functions by and large. You had an eat what you kill approach where someone is expected to find a deal, to execute the deal, and then wave that hanky at ops. And I think that tended to create internal competition that was probably unhealthy. Now I'm going to shoot down your deal because you spoke negatively about my deal, that kind of thing. Well, in BD, you could have the same kind of thing going on to a lesser extent. I think that the healthiest approach is to have people compensated for their efforts in BD, for the results, but a combination of the two. Because there are times when the BD person will have done everything that you've asked them to do. They've brought in great opportunities, and for reasons exogenous to their efforts, a deal didn't get done. So the compensation, I think, has to be thoughtful with respect to making sure that you continue to engender a team attitude and approach and treatment of each other while still creating some fire in the belly for the successes. It's a combination of the two.
Okay.
You're one of the most low ego, long time horizon, like deeply caring people I've ever kind of known in private equity. To the extent, I mean, to the point of some of the things we've discussed throughout the podcast here. Sometimes it's small things where you've sent a thoughtful response to a deal or opportunity I logged with you. Sometimes it's even just getting your holiday card. That's something deeply personal. But I guess what should folks take or kind of learn from your career? Like if you're thinking about educating or mentoring the next generation of sourcing professional, like what would you want them to know?
Don't assume that people have been doing things a long time or who are ostensibly experts have all the great ideas. Things change over time. And I often describe any revelations that I've had as sort of strokes of the obvious. It may strike you as being very obvious, but you can easily assume that other people are doing something well, and they're not necessarily. So explore your ideas and innovations. They're hard to come by, but I think that's valuable. I'm a clanging gong on this, but it's to me the relationships are fun and so important to being effective. So spend the time to ask somebody, what do you do for fun? It's a stock phrase, but I genuinely want to know. In talking to a company owner, we may talk for an hour or hours or an entire day about a business. And then when I really come to find out that his esoteric passion, his hobby, and being terminally curious, maybe I've dabbled in that, or I'm just curious about it and we'll ask him about it. Or I can send him a book or send her a book about that passion. I'm not a big wave surfer, but I've got a great book for anyone who has ever been on a surfboard, and that person will spend hours thinking about you. Finding commonality, genuinely trying to be helpful and build trust with anybody that you're dealing with, whether it's an intermediary or a colleague or, a target company especially.
It sounds like your advice would be maybe be a little bit less efficient and slow down a little to be more human and more fun.
When you think that it is someone where you should or where you just genuinely want to, yeah.
I love it. Well, thank you, Glenn, for coming on. Man, this has been an amazing time to spend together. You're a true legend at the sport, and we're kind of honored to have spent this time with you today. So thank you.
Thank you. You're too generous. You're too kind, and I'm grateful for the opportunity, guys. Good to be with you.